All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on organizational sustainability. This is actually part 2 of a 2-part series. This one's going to be focusing a little bit on executive transition management and that side of succession planning and making sure your organization is sustainable in terms of leadership and succession. The one on Monday, we focused a little bit more on succession planning and leadership development. And so that recording we're going to be posting in the next couple of days to our website. We do already have the slides posted, so you can access those on our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence page of our website under Tools and Resources, and go to Category 7 for the one that was done on Monday on leadership development. And then this one for today, I sent the link to the slides in the chat box, but it is also, the slides are also located on the website under Category 4 under our Organizational Standards page of our website. So hopefully everyone's able to find those materials to be able to reference, and we'll go ahead and get started. As I see many of you connecting, we have a small but mighty group today. We are recording this webinar for access later, and so I have hit that button, so we'll go ahead and get started. For our agenda for today, what we're going to be focusing on is the why, of course, of executive transition management. Why should you care? Why is this important? As well as what's required. And so we want to kind of get those two things crossed off first. Then we'll go into some about succession planning in general, then talk more about executive transition management specifically, into kind of splitting it out into 3 different phases: preparation, search and selection, and onboarding. And then we'll go over some various resources that you can access. So I don't think our content will actually even fill up the whole hour today. So we'll go ahead and get started on through this. Just another note too before we get started, if you do have questions as we go through, please enter those into the chat box. And I'll pause probably in the middle if we have any that come through, as well as at the end. So feel free to send those through as you have them, and then I'll pause to address them as they pile up. So this was an interesting quote that I found in one of the resources that I was looking at on this topic. It says that 10% or more of nonprofits experience a leadership transition annually, and nearly 70% of these are non-routine. And so whenever you first look at it and you say, well, you know, 10%, that doesn't seem like a ton, but it's on an annual basis. So you think about that over the long term, the number is probably higher of how many leadership transitions actually happen. But I think the part that's good to pay attention to is that 70% of these are actually non-routine. And sometimes we think about, especially executive transition or some of the higher level positions in the organization, we think of those a lot of times as possibly being planned. Maybe there's retirement coming up, or at least maybe there is you know, some kind of indication that it might be happening. But to say that 70% of these are kind of non-routine is to say that, you know, it might be unexpected. And so this is why this topic is so important to pay attention to. And we want to make sure that we're prepared for transitions to make sure that they go as smoothly as possible. This is another quote from the same resource here that said, poor transitions in leadership are happening more frequently, accompanied by negative outcomes that pose significant threat to the nonprofit sector as a whole and those reliant on nonprofit systems. So, you know, whenever I talk about preparation and trying to be prepared for executive transitions and preparing by doing succession planning, you know, you're never going to be fully prepared, but being at some level prepared can help for these transitions to not end up being determined as poor or, you know, producing some sort of negative outcomes that produce some sort of threat to the organization. So this kind of thing is very important, not only to your specific nonprofit, but looking at kind of a system of nonprofits and how the different nonprofits work together in the human services system is important to look at on that macro level as well. And kind of shifting over to possibly the positive of transitions, looking at transitions as being powerful and even under-realized. So there really can be opportunities to strengthen an organization as well. And so the link to this resource is right here in your slide for whenever you download the slide deck. But, you know, really looking at transitions not is a scary thing because, you know, while it can be kind of nerve-wracking to think about transitions and change, it's also something that can actually produce some great opportunity and in the long run and be a beneficial thing for the organization. So handling it right through the process is something that's going to make it more likely to be a positive, powerful, and strengthening thing for the organization. So that's a little bit about the why, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through, but also looking at what's required. So this is part of the reasoning behind doing a webinar on this is that it is grounded in one of our organizational standards for the CSBG network. And so organizational standard 4.5, which is in the organizational leadership category, states that the organization has to have a written succession plan in place for the CEO or executive director, approved by the governing board, which contains procedures for covering an emergency unplanned, a short-term absence of 3 months or less, as well as outlines process for filling a permanent vacancy. So it kind of has to have those different levels to it as far as specific for temporary as well as permanent and that emergency piece of it. And then the other piece of that is that it does have to be approved by the governing board. So the board of the organization does need to be involved in the process of maybe not specifically writing the succession plan, but it does have to be agreed upon and approved by the governing board. So the board has to be bought into this process and understand the importance of it as well, especially with executive transitions, because the board is responsible for hiring executive directors or CEOs for the organization. And so something that is very important for the board to be involved in and understand kind of what process they might have to go through for whenever it does come time. And I think that one thing that organizations sometimes struggle with is, you know, the preparation for something like this can be somewhat time-consuming, but it can really pay off in the end whenever you do come to a time where transition is necessary. And so a lot of times it might be something that's kind of, you know, when you think about that as time management matrix, it kind of gets put in that important but not urgent category or quadrant 2. And so I think that to put it in more of the, you know, we need to go ahead and get it done now and help people understand the reality, this organizational standard can kind of help do that and start that conversation within the agency in looking at how can we best meet this organizational standard and at the same time really prepare our agency to have a successful transition whenever that might occur. You know, you might not want to think about what would happen if your organization, you know, lost the executive director in some way to retirement, another position, whatever it might be. But, you know, things just happen. And so being prepared for those things can really, you know, make for greater success later. And so really trying to bring this to the top for people and, like, let people know that it's not a scary thing to talk about. It was just something that needs to be prepared for. So again, why should we really plan for this? Why should we plan for executive transition as well as succession planning for key positions in the organization? And it kind of, you know, first, just like what I was talking about, it really gets us beyond an uncomfortable truth that we, you know, might try to avoid sometimes. All careers lead to a transition eventually. It's just basically a matter of when, how, and how well managed it might be. And so being prepared on the front end for no matter when it might happen, whether it's this year, 5 years from now, or 20, is, you know, the best case scenario. Also, planning for this helps ensure organizational sustainability because you're thinking about all of these things in terms of organizational capacity and that long-term sustainability for the organization and how we're going to be able to carry out these programs and services that people need with our purpose of being here. So and just really kind of brings those conversations to the forefront and helps to plan for long-term sustainability. Also helps increase the likelihood of successful transitions. I've already talked about that a little bit, but if you plan ahead, it's much more likely to be a positive change rather than negative. And then it also helps to mitigate risk. And so there's things that can happen during an executive transition that create more risk for the organization. And so kind of planning ahead and trying to get as many ducks in a row as possible can help mitigate some of these potential what-ifs and things that can come up that would be more in the negative experience. A couple other things to think about when you're planning for succession and transition is really to use clear communication and set the process so that it can run more smoothly whenever it does happen. That clear communication needs to be both to board and staff, so managing that communication and really making sure that people know what they need to know and also understand the importance of this process for no matter when it might happen. So, in thinking about transition, it's kind of, like you're looking at crossing a bridge. And so whenever I was thinking about this, the way that you plan for any sort of transition or succession, whether it's executive or other key positions, you kind of want to think about what type of bridge do you want to be on whenever you have to cross it. And so looking at these pictures, just want you to consider for a moment which one you want your agency to be on whenever that transition, becomes a reality. And so if you prepared ahead and built the right bridge to cross for whenever you get to the point when you need to cross it, then it's going to ensure success more in the long run. And so you look at the bridge in the top left corner. You might be able to get across this one okay, but I would have my reservations if I approach this bridge, then I might end up falling through and fall into that creek that maybe is below. And so, you've got some unsturdy boards possibly built up across it, but overall it's pretty well covered by moss, and it looks like the boards are somewhat rotted. So you definitely, planning ahead will hopefully, surely ensure that you're not on a bridge like that to any sort of end of your transition. But if you really plan ahead and, look at your organizational sustainability and think through succession and, what's important for when that time comes, you're much more likely to be on a bridge like is depicted in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and, which will feel much more sturdy as you're going across that transition. So just kind of a consideration and a visualization for that. So there's 4 different elements as we're talking about organizational sustainability and that piece carrying us through the long term and through transitions. There's 4 different elements that we really need to consider. And so, in the middle you have your organizational strategy, your business model. So really looking at your strategic plan. Where are you now? Where are you headed? What have you achieved? And what is that kind of overall strategy and those strategic priorities that you have for your organization? Then also leadership. So that's really kind of that piece that we've been focusing on through our previous webinar as well as today. What type of leadership do we have to carry us through these different transitions and sustain us for the long term? And then also resources. So this is looking at both human resources, we're looking at financial resources, as well as, the different resources that we build within our organization to, provide programs and services to our constituents. And so all of these things kind of work together, but they're all encompassed by the culture of the organization. And so really ensuring that the culture of the organization is healthy and strong, and just sound for moving forward is going to help ensure this organizational sustainability. And I think also really understanding that the culture kind of encompasses all of those things in the middle as well is important. It's not its own bubble just out on its own, but it really relates to each piece of that. And the organizational culture is really important to how sustainable the organization is going to be long term. So this is kind of an overview of leadership sustainability and executive transition management. We're going to see another graphic that's similar to this later on in presentation, but whenever you're really looking at kind of this process and what needs to be done prior to as you prepare for executive transition management, you're looking at kind of the light purple over on the left side, and you're looking at these succession essentials, leader development planning, departure defined planning, as well as organizational sustainability planning. And we're going to talk about a few of these in a moment. These are really things that kind of help you prepare for where you're headed, and as you take this trajectory towards organizational capacity all the way across these pieces. Then in the next point, wherever you start to pivot, you're looking at, clarifying leadership transitions, stabilizing any kind of situations that might be present, that might be, unstable in any way, and then starting to really plan for the switch in the transition. So this would be once you know that that transition is going to happen, you start doing these type of things. And so you can also see that this first preparation piece really takes about 1 to 4 years. And it depends on the organization, depends on what challenges are present, but really understanding that this isn't just a couple month thing, that you're going to be able to just prepare up your organization, but it's really just kind of an ongoing process. So even once you get prepared for a transition, it doesn't just stop. And so it might take, 1 to 4 years to get you to where you might want to be as far as an organization to be, pretty much ready for a transition. But then that takes maintenance over time as well. And then this part where we really start to pivot, we're looking at the kind of 4 to 6 months as we phase into that search and selection process and really prepare the organization for the transition that we know is now happening. And then once we get to the point where we have a leader for the organization, that's where we really, hopefully, we'll be looking to thrive. There'll be organizational capacity present. It'll be on that upward trajectory. And then we'll really launch and support that new executive director or CEO towards, for future growth. So this is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about these 3 different pieces in a little bit different terms, but really kind of focusing a little bit more on the preparation standpoint. So with succession planning, this is part of that preparation piece where we really want to look at preparation for the executive director, as well as kind of modeling this from the top down and making sure that we take the requirement and the purpose of having the executive director with a succession plan. Also through the other positions in the organization to make sure that we're not only sustainable at that top level and ready for transition and succession, but that as other key leaders might lead the organization, that we are prepared for that piece as well. Because while it's a huge transition when the executive director or CEO might go out, it can also be a very huge transition for key positions or really key people to leave the organization also. And so making sure that we have a plan in place as well as there's some sort of knowledge transfer is really important. So not just the position being filled, but that knowledge transfer to happen. Because I think we all know kind of what happens when one person holds all of that knowledge, they leave, and then people are left with not knowing a lot of important things. So there's 2 kind of philosophical frames to succession planning. One is really looking at replacement, so of course filling a position after departure. And then another one is looking at really kind of that developmental, so developing that pipeline of leaders, which is really what we focused on in Monday's webinar. And so you want to make sure that you're developing up people that are going to be able to move up throughout the organization and be strong leaders in the organization for the long term. But then also there might be times when you're going to be hiring out as well, and that's okay too, because new perspectives from different fields or from similar human service organizations can be really valuable as well. But really making sure that that development is happening internally also, so that both pieces can be possible. Then there's three different components to succession planning. So there's leadership development, that really proactive talent management, which again we focused on in the first webinar. Then you're looking at departure defined, so organizational prep for sustainability and the executive prep for transition. So there's two different pieces of that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Then looking at succession essentials, so having those emergency backup plans, board-adopted succession policy. So these are kind of the must-haves of succession planning, the requirements, what to do in an emergency, making sure all your documents are, in place for if this happens. But the other two above this is really where we want to focus on making sure the organization is, if we were going to personify it, kind of emotionally, mentally ready to really take on some sort of transition like this. So with leader development, won't go into this a lot, but just kind of a review of what we talked about in the first webinar. That succession planning, when coupled with a very comprehensive leadership development program, can prepare an agency for any unexpected departure of key staff, while also increasing capacity of the organization to adapt, change, and meet challenges of the future. And so basically having this leadership development program that's ongoing, that has been in place, and being able to have that talent that's come up through the organization can be really essential to making things run smoother as you go into some sort of change process. And so this is something we talked about in the other webinar, but focusing more on the executive director piece. So if you think about it by assessing kind of bench strength and establishing a leadership bench, so people who can kind of move up through the ranks of the organization, you would kind of look at it like this. So not really just plugging in your organizational chart, but taking the executive director and looking down through who could be potential candidates for the executive director position if the executive director were to leave. And so then really focusing on, which candidates might be ready now, which candidates might be ready in the future, what development might need to take place to be able to get there. And so this can just make the process easier to think through ahead of time who could be potential internal candidates. Again, maybe it's internal candidates, or maybe at some point it could be an external candidate. But having that good, strong internal capacity is good regardless. And then we also talked about departure defined, so as part of one of the components of succession planning, and really looking at the organizational prep for sustainability as well as the executive prep for transition. And so there's kind of two tracks to this. You'll see on the vertical axis we're talking about the organizational readiness. And then on the horizontal, we're talking more about the executive readiness. And so as we progress through this kind of trajectory on each side, on the horizontal, when we're looking at the executive readiness factors, we're looking at timing, we're looking at professionally, or have they prepared the organization? Is there minimal unfinished business where it would make it easy for someone to come in, or is there a lot of stuff that's there that's unresolved that somebody would have to pick up? And do they have, an exit and departure plan in place of, what that would look like upon their departure? And then it's also personal. So professional is a lot of times what we think of because we think more of, the organization and their professional role in that. But personal, is the executive, and if you're an executive director listening, someday if you transition, or maybe you're transitioning soon, are you ready? Moving on, do you have something to move on to? Are you emotionally ready to let go? Financially, are you ready? Is there family factors to consider? And also support network. So especially leaders who have been in their role for many, many years, possibly decades, that can be something that is very difficult whenever you end up moving on and going through kind of being so involved in your organization and leading it and having real passion for what you do, to then not really having kind of that big piece of your life there. So, there's definitely other things, of course, that can be in that, and maybe retirement is also very appealing, of course, but also just thinking through all of those different factors is important to make sure the transition goes well and the executive really examines their readiness, both professionally and personally. And I think that timing factor kind of fits into both the personal and the professional, because you're thinking, is it a good time for me personally as an executive? Also, is it a good time for me as a professional in the organization, as well as organizationally, is it a good time as well? And so being able to kind of actually map out readiness on a trajectory like this, executive directors kind of doing this, even just as kind of a personal exercise, would be good. You could kind of do like a scatter plot here on this trajectory. Then as far as organizational readiness factors, critical sustainability factors, have those been addressed for the organization? Is there that succession policy or transition plan in place for when that might happen? Also, is there some sort of financial cushion that is present to make this easier financially on the organization? And then for the board, also, are they understanding what this might mean for the organization and what is their role in it? So do they have that kind of competency built up to be able to handle this transition and really help guide it, honestly? And do they have that leadership to really lead it into the future and onboard the next executive director as well? And then as far as staff, so thinking about, do we have the right skills on the team to be able to carry on forward? Is the team structured for the future? So what does the organizational structure look like? Is it working? Is it functional? Is it efficient? And then also, what is their transition to succession competency? Would they be ready to handle something like this? So there's lots of different factors to think of organizationally. At the same time, while an executive is thinking personally and professionally for themselves about their readiness. So definitely encourage you to kind of use this as a tool to be able to gauge readiness in both of these different accesses. And then as far as succession essentials, this is kind of looking at, are these essentials in place to ensure the continuity? So this is looking at that board adopted succession plan. So of course, making sure it's developed as well as approved by the governing board to meet that organizational standard. And are there kind of those emergency plans in place, which is actually encompassed in that organizational standard as well? And then that backup plan. So kind of having a backup to your backup plan is important too, because there might be, if there's an acting executive director that's been kind of determined, there might be something that happens to where that person is not available to fill that role at that time either. So, there always has to be kind of a backup to your backup. And really thinking about this, we want to also consider the process. So thinking about how the process is just as important as the actual plan itself. So when you're going through this succession plan policy drafting, not just writing it out and making it, taking it to the board for that check for the organizational standards, but really thinking about the process and who needs to be involved in that, what different things should you be thinking through to really help that be a plan for the preparation for if this was really going to happen. Also thinking about connections to the strategic plan. So looking at assessment of staff capacity to be able to carry out strategic plans, outcomes and objectives. And then really looking also at diversity. So thinking about, what does your community look like? What is the commitment of the organization to this ideal? And what kind of factors around that do we have to consider as we work through a major transition at some point? So this is looking at the process overview of executive transition management. The graphic you saw a few slides ago that had the yellow boxes on it also is very similar. So there's a lot of different kind of frameworks to executive transition. But this one is a good kind of three-step piece where we really look at the outcome of this increased capacity to deliver the organization's mission under new leadership. So again, looking at the same sort of things under prepare, but looking at these kind of 4 critical factors to search and transition as we prepare. So organizing and tailoring the process, you know, and writing that out in some way. Gathering the information that we might need to know in preparation for a transition. Engaging the board, making sure they are prepared. And then developing ahead of time that profile and search plan. So knowing what you might be looking for the next executive director, even before that current executive director leaves. And so this is something that is really important to consider and think through for the next executive director to be most successful and to really fill the next position, fill that next vacancy with the right person. Because most likely you don't want to just you know, dust something off and send it right back out there that maybe was put out 15 years ago. Things have changed for the organization. And so being able to really consider what does this organization need now, and even if you know you're not going to be looking at a transition real soon, putting this together in kind of a draft format of what you think you might need, and then being able to revisit it when the transition does happen, can at least get you at a starting point to where you have something to work from and know that you've already kind of considered those different things. Then as you move into the search piece, as you launch the search, you'll want to, of course, recruit, screen, select, and then hire. And you'll really want to just think through how you do this ahead of time in this preparation piece. So there's lots of different ways, we're going to talk a little bit more in a moment, of how you can recruit and screen and select and hire. So really thinking about the best way to do that for your particular agency. Then as you onboard, thinking about what type of things that next executive director is going to need, who's going to have to help support in that process, you know, what is the evaluation process going to look like for that, you know, person's first 90 days, annual, you know, and all of those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of different things, especially with the board executive alignment on priorities, roles, and performance measures that will have to be established. But kind of revisiting those ahead of time can be helpful to make sure that they are kind of in place or just need some minor edits when you get to that point, can be very helpful. So as we dig more into these different pieces that you saw in the graphic, you really want to ensure that the organization is ready to search and hire. So don't just kind of throw out the old job description once you get to search and hire, but really planning for it during this preparation phase. Pieces of this are also ensuring that the organization is stable. So looking at how financially stable they are, you know, politically, emotionally. So really want to ensure that all of these kind of pieces are in place and the capacity and strength of the organization is sound. Of course, you're never going to be perfect at it, but this is kind of the ideal, and getting it to the best place possible is good. Also looking at having a smart, committed, and available board chair and committee. So again, the board really leads this process of, you know, selecting and hiring and, you know, the executive director, and even some of the onboarding as well, because they're involved in that overall, you know, evaluation process as the executive moves forward in helping to really support and ensure success for that executive director. Also, you know, knowing that this takes time. And so we looked at that one graphic that said, you know, that preparation phase really looks at, you know, 1 to 4 years for getting prepared for this sort of thing. And it's going to vary for every agency, but understanding really what those current needs are, as well as future leadership needs, where you're headed, what those changing technology, economics, social aspects of things are, and really being attuned to those. So this is going to really require assessment, it's going to require reflection and planning, and it's going to require different perspectives. So even talking to other organizations in the area on, how different transitions have gone for them, that would be a good idea. Also looking at different types of organizational assessments, or looking at, where are we at as far as, sustainability, our impact, our staff capacity, or even just our kind of health or culture of our organization. And I think also, the other pieces of that is really making sure we're bringing both the board and the staff into those discussions. So it's not just the executive director or one other key staff member, looking at these things, kind of getting those different perspectives. So those are kind of 4 big questions that really drive the search. So making sure that the board is clear on these ahead of time can make it so that there's less scrambling when the time comes. So looking at, who do you want to hire? What does that profile look like? You want to definitely think about what it looks like for the current executive director, but look at it also in terms of, what are these changing things around us, and how do we need to look differently at things as we look towards the future. It might be similar to a profile of who you currently have, but there might be some different aspects. And it's not good or bad. It's just simply, who do we need with changing times and with the future. And then also, why? Why is that profile what we need? And what's that link to the future direction? So we have to be able to ground it in something. We have to be able to look at maybe the strategic plan and see how that's going to help carry the strategic plan of the organization forward. We have to look at it as, how is this profile going to help us overcome challenges that we might be facing, or leverage our strengths that we have as an organization in this community. So really just kind of looking at all those connections and that big picture piece of it. And then what do you want the new executive to do? What are those priorities? How are they similar or different to what the current executive director is doing? And again, not good or bad, but just simply looking at, what is it that we need moving forward? And then what do we need to do to get ready? So where are those pieces of unfinished business? Where are those little cobwebs at that the new executive might have to find and clean up? And so really thinking about kind of all of those different pieces and making sure that we're ready on all different fronts. Again, looking at financial, emotional health of the organization, the culture, the capacity, all of that. Then also looking at addressing any organizational barriers to executive readiness. So if there's kind of a lack of an obvious successor, so again, looking back to that chart where you're looking at assessing that organizational leadership bench. If you're looking at that and you're thinking, I don't even know who you put in these candidate spots, then that would be something to consider and think about. Who might be able to, who do we need to, how do we need to work on our leadership development in our organization so we have these people that we might look at as successors for key positions. Again, is there any unfinished business? Are we kind of stuck waiting for that perfect time? And again, there's not going to be any perfect time for a transition. It's never going to be perfect, we've prepared for, but you can become pretty well prepared for an executive transition to where organizations do see it go over pretty successfully. And then is there a board or staff resistance to change? So do we need to kind of start helping people through now the idea of change before the big change actually happens? And so making sure that, we have all of these kind of pieces in place, and some others include, making sure that the CEO or executive director job is more doable. So, how has it been for the current executive director or CEO, and how do we make that a little bit better for the next successor? Also dealing with any system issues, what needs fixing? Are there areas where they've been over-reliant on the CEO, or maybe that needs to become a little bit more, a little bit less reliant in a way? And also bring up CEO salary and benefits to market rate, so making sure you're doing those salary surveys to be sure that you're offering competitive, dollars to the next successor. So just also with preparation, a few more things to mention. Making sure business model is viable, organizational strategy is relevant. We want to make sure the board is kind of prepared and ready to partner with the next successor and move forward. With staff, really thinking about strengthening the senior management team and addressing any structure issues. Looking at resource development methods that might be relevant or productive to this, preparing for this process, and building kind of that financial cushion for the successor. And then with culture, really focusing in on building resiliency and empowering the team to really shift the culture away from over-reliance on the CEO. So again, talking about that reliance piece, but that's kind of a culture shift a lot of times, not necessarily kind of a task type shift. So different tips for preparation, being clear about handling internal candidates. So having that conversation up front, how would that be handled? Are they going to be, put in the, recruitment and interview process and everything just like everyone else? Are we going to do like kind of a round of internal interviews, first before we open it up to external? If we have several internal candidates, really how is that going to look for this organization to make it equitable and fair for our situation? Also being clear about the commitment to diversity. So I talked about this a little bit before, but looking at kind of externally to the outside community, looking at internally to the organization, and looking at what is the commitment we have to diversity? What is the commitment we want to have to diversity? And so having those conversations up front. Also resisting the temptation to hire too quickly. I would say that I've been in a couple different organizations, or seen a couple different organizations that have looked at this transition process, and a lot of times this is one of those things that it's very tempting. You just want to get somebody in there. But sometimes that can be kind of dangerous because you don't think through all of those factors before hiring someone in. Also striving for a good ending with the current executive, so making sure that not only do we just go into this transition well, but that we really help the other executive director to transition out really well. And then the consideration of bringing on kind of an interim or acting ED or CEO in the meantime to really help give time to the process that the time is due for. Then as we go into search and selection, this is really where we look at who are we going to hire and how are we going to get to that point. And so making sure that we have a clear position profile that's not just pulled out of an old file cabinet somewhere and resubmitted. Really taking the time during preparation to decide what does that need to look like, and then making any final adjustments in the search and selection phase. Then making sure you have a smart strategic search plan to really market the position. So thinking about what different platforms are we going to put this in? If they're local newspaper or their online outlets, we want to make sure it is in so people see it. Where are people looking for jobs these days, and how do we need to market this position? Making sure that you have a robust outreach to build the pool. So not just where you put it, but kind of how you advertise it, and making sure that really you get to those places where the right people are going to hear about it to be able to want to apply. You want to make sure you also have a diverse finalist pool. So this, again, it starts with really that strategic outreach plan that you put in place to make sure you have that diverse finalist pool. Thinking about multi-stage vetting and interview process. So is it going to be, applications come in, who is going to review those, who's going to determine the interviews, who's going to be in on the interviews, how many interviews are we going to do, to really make sure that we cast the net wide as well as deep for understanding who the candidates are, and how good of a fit they would be for the position. Also engaging staff in the process. So not necessarily in the interviews, but engaging them in maybe the process of pieces of the physician profile, or really looking at maybe that pieces of outreach. Where do we need to be putting this to where the right people see it? But making sure that they're at least involved in the process, but not in the confidential nature of the interviews and applications and that part. Also identifying and addressing legacy issues or making them known to the finalists. So thinking about what pieces are transparent and what pieces are more confidential. But making sure that there are some of those transparent pieces so that there's not kind of that feeling of secretism over the previous executive director, or just making sure that these people coming into the position would really be prepared because of any maybe issues that are present. And then once you get on to post-hire and onboarding, this is when you're looking at kind of how do we bring this person on, how do we communicate about it, and really ensuring the success of them long term. So, we're talking about the appropriate announcement plan and actions. So what do those people need to know, and who needs to know as well. And then providing a solid orientation for the new executive director, really striving for a great launch of them in this position. Also giving the executive, kind of a 90-day entry plan, ideally before day one, before they walk in the door and get. And this is something that, it says here that the new executive develops this entry plan, but it needs to be something that, with a little guidance from someone. And so being able to at least let them know kind of what they need to know, who they need to know, and really thinking about kind of a staggered approach so that it's not just thrown at them all at once is good too, because there's community action can be a learning curve, and especially trying to lead an organization that's multi-service with a lot of different funding streams and aspects to it. It's important to really think through priorities and have someone else help guide a person in knowing what do you need to do first, who do you need to know first, and that sort of thing. And then paying attention to board executive social contracts. So agree on kind of those 12 to 18-month priorities between the executive director and the board, clarifying roles, responsibilities, and expectations up front, so the executive kind of knows that early on. Going in phases, again, that staggering approach, and really kind of thinking through those challenges of taking charge with the new staff, and just whatever that culture might be, and what challenges might be present. And then establishing a performance monitoring and evaluation process, and also being clear on that up front, can be very helpful to the new executive director. Another thing, especially if you have statewide networks of community action agencies, a mentoring aspect of the onboarding can be really helpful. So if you have in your state network, several different community action agencies, maybe you have some urban and rural agencies that are similar to your agency, think about what agencies might have good executive directors that could be good mentors to a new executive director in your organization, so that they can kind of at least have somebody to call on, somebody to ask questions to as they're getting oriented to the new position. So this is a little bit more here about personal planning. We talked about this some, but I'll mostly just leave this to reading through on your own if you're interested, especially if you're an executive director that might be leaving in the future, and really thinking through some of these different questions for yourself to know if it's really time, if you feel ready personally. So there's different kind of early stage planning that can take place, and so being attuned to these sort of things, and just making sure that these are just some different tips involved in early stage planning to make sure that it goes most smoothly for you especially, and then in turn it will for the organization if you're most prepared. So went through quite a bit pretty quick today, but there's lots of different tools on this, and really it's just to make sure you're thinking ahead on these things and kind of diving into these different preparation pieces. And depending on where your organization is at with this, but there's actually a 3-part series that we have. Here's a partnership. We work with transition guides on this, and so it is altered for community action, and so it can be helpful in that way. But the first piece, focuses on the organizational sustainability. Second piece focuses on the executive succession, and then that third piece really focuses on the transition management piece. So those are accessible on our website under tools and resources. And so this is kind of a list of the different tools that are included. So there's like actual templates in there, there's different assessments, different kind of agreement and work plans, timelines. So it can be really helpful to just walk through the process. Here's an example of the transition template. So kind of gives different activities, their responsibility, who would have that responsibility, what that target date is for that, and the estimate time needed to carry that out. So planning ahead of time in that way. And again, all of those can be found under tools and resources on our website at communityactionpartnership.com. And these are a couple outside resources as well. NEKC Foundation had one posted on capturing the power of leadership change, and that was what I had those quotes from early on in the presentation. And then Transition Guides also has a lot of different good resources around executive transition management, and that's who Community Action Partnership partnered with on those guides that I just showed as well. All right, so that concludes our webinar for today. I don't think I found any questions that have come through. So if you do have any questions as you move forward or as you're thinking about these things, feel free to reach out to myself, contact information here on the screen, or you can reach out to anyone on our training technical assistance team. Our director is John Crocker. So our information is on the website as well. But don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything else, and we appreciate your time today. Thank you.